Families are in such a mess. Families have changed what they define and call a family and all of these different things. But we're going to look at, again, this idea of these two particular critical needs that children have in any family. And again, we're going to talk a little bit about this. Again, we will talk about it as we go through this idea of child-centered parenting and what exactly it means and the dangers of child-centered parenting. But, God has given all of us a certain innate need. We have many needs. And God has given us needs, given children needs. Children need to know certain things. They need to have certain structure around them. And again, we must properly make sure we're meeting the needs of our children, these particular needs, as parents. And again, realizing that a child needs security, both not only security physically, but they need it emotionally as well as they develop. And the first need that we're going to look at is the need to identify or knowing that they belong. Knowing that they belong. And, you might think, well, when I was a child, maybe I didn't feel like I belonged, in my family. And God has given us the responsibility of parenting and making sure that our children know that they belong. We might want to call this the root factor, right? They have to have roots. They have to know, hey, I am part of this family. And, there are certain children that, may have greater insecurities than other children, and they may just feel, I just don't feel like I belong. I just don't feel like I'm part of the family. I just don't feel like I'm as loved as one of the other kids or maybe some of the other kids. This morning, again, Lord willing, we're going to be looking at Joseph. And last week, again, we looked at Joseph and we saw his family problems. He was a favored son, and all the other brothers, they saw his favoritism. They saw that their dad liked him better than the other kids and gave him more things and treated him differently and all of those things. That they may have felt that, hey, we just don't belong in the, like Joseph belongs in the family. And the child's perception is going to be something, again, that we ultimately can't control. But we've got to make sure that the child is rooted in our family. All the children are equally a part of the family, making sure that they know they belong, they're not excluded. And there's all kinds of psychology out there when it comes to parenting. Some of it's true, depending sometimes on how many children you have in your family. That can determine how you end up falling in line when it comes to your family. There was a guy I worked with, Gary, and he was quite a guy. And I said to him one day, I said, Gary, are you an only child? And he said, yeah, how'd you know that? And I said, I can tell. He said, you can tell I was an only child? I said, yeah. And he says, well, how come? I says, because everything revolves around you. I mean, there's no others. I mean, it's you. And I could just tell that, And then, Diane, she had a job babysitting as family. Maybe you've heard of Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto. Well, Nathan Phillips' son lived right behind Diane growing up in London. And so she got the job of babysitting their kids. And the one boy, the young boy, he's about 4 years old, changed when his little sister was born. And I remember seeing him and going, what's going on with this kid? And, he was soiling himself and sitting there sucking his thumb and crying like a baby, acting like a baby, because he didn't like the fact that his little sister was now getting all the attention. And of course, a little baby is going to need more attention than a 4-year-old, you would think. And, that boy, he just totally changed his behavior. Now, you'd say that maybe is a little excessive, and that's not really anything to do with anyone's parenting or the way that they're parenting. But, it is very possible that in a lot of situations, an older child, and again, for the most part, this happened in my family, the older child gets the responsibilities. They get, back in my day, you got a driver's license at 16. And not only did you get a beginner's, you could get your beginner's one day when you turned 16, and then 2 weeks later or a week later, you could go take your driver's test and get your full license. Full license, drive anywhere you wanted, 401, wherever. Anyways, my brother, he got his license 16, and he could take the car wherever he wanted. When I turned 16 and got my license, I wasn't allowed to take the car. I wasn't old enough. My brother was the responsible one, and then my sister came along. And, of course, she was always a little bit spoiled and given things. And so there is a tendency, and you're saying, oh, Pastor, that's just your perspective. But it happens. I mean, it does happen. There are generally patterns in a family where the older one will get the responsibility. The younger one, the middle one is generally either too young or too old. And the young one, of course, is the one that gets hampered or pampered or whatever it may be. And you may be thinking, well, Pastor, those kind of things happened in my family as well. And, they're patterns. And so we've got to make sure, as far as that goes, that we're treating the children equally, and understanding that responsibility needs to be given to them as they grow older, whether the older or the younger or whatever. My brother would always be the babysitter at least when we got old enough. He became the babysitter, and that was his responsibility. So we had to follow him. And Justine, I know when our kids got old enough, Justine would be the babysitter when we went away, when she was 13 or 14 years old or whatever. If we went out for a little while, and I'm sure my kids will all have stories about that. But again, understanding, teaching and making sure your children know that they belong. And the second part of this is that's part of the identity, where they identify in your family. But the social need, again, and this is where they belong. Where they belong. What part or what role, and we might call that the role factor. What role do they have in your family? And we'll expand on all of this. Maybe you're going to say, Pastor, by the time we're done this, you might say, Pastor, I'm not really sure how these are going to play out, or how I can make sure I'm meeting their identity need, how they're making sure that that they know where they belong. We will expand on this as we go through. But a child has a definite need to know that they belong within the family unit, but equally important is that he needs to know where he belongs in that family. Again, I think no matter how old your children are, as they're growing up, they should all have a part. They should have a part. You're never too young to help out set the table. You're never too young to go out and help mom and dad. You're not going to, or dad cutting the grass, you're not going to give your 3-year-old the keys to the lawn tractor. Amen? Or hey, Dave, you wouldn't give your 3-year-old the keys to the tractor to go tell him to plow the field. You'd wait till he's at least 5, right? So, you understand that you give them responsibilities according to their age, but they can still help out. They can be part and work into the family. And, one of the things that I remember, we lived in an area for many years where there was a lot of old order Amish. And when I mean old order, they not only were horse and buggy, but they weren't even allowed to have battery lamps on their buggies. They had to have kerosene lamps on their buggies. They couldn't have windshields on their buggies. There are a lot of things that they weren't allowed to have. They were very old order. But, we were good friends with several of them, and we used to go over to Roman Miller's, and he had, I think, a dozen kids, just a small family. But you go over there during the day, and it was never, to go over to an Amish house during the day was never a good idea, because they're doing their jobs, and they've got a farm to run, a house to run, 12 kids to feed, and lots of ironing, lots of clothes, lots of cooking, lots of things to do. And they try, of course, to stay off the grid as much as possible, so they process most of their own food and do all that they can that way. So you go over there. We did a couple times go over there during the day, and you'd walk into the kitchen, and a couple of the girls would be working in the kitchen doing some preparation for supper. You'd go into another room. There would be a couple other girls in there. They would be canning. They'd be taking whatever, chicken. I remember the one time they were canning chicken. And they're doing this. And then you go out, and a couple of the boys are out in the barn milking cows, and a couple of the other boys, they're over here maybe doing work with the other animals, and the other ones, a couple others are fixing the barn or working on a shed or doing something. They're all doing something. And believe it or not, none of them were sitting around on their phones or watching something on television. Now, you're saying, Pastor, of course, they didn't have those things, but maybe it was a good thing they didn't. But they all had a place. That was my point. They all knew what they were supposed to be doing, and they were all doing it. And, in our world today, when we think about, and we'll talk about the world today, where does a child fit in? Not only in family, but what is a family, and how do you structure a family? You see, if you don't have the family structure, if you don't have a functioning family, if you're looking at the dysfunctional families in our world today, it's very hard for a child to know that they fit in. And that's why we have so many children today that are lost. And I don't mean spiritually lost. I mean, they're just lost. Kids today don't know who they are, what they are, where they're going. And so if we don't make sure that we are bringing our children up in these areas, and again, making sure that they know where they belong, they know all of these things about who they are, why they are, where they belong, they're going to end up, of course, rebellious. They're going to reject things. They're going to reject your values. They're going to reject even you as parents. And again, depending on how we view themselves, or children end up viewing themselves when they're growing up, is going to really affect how they are when they're adults, and whether they end up self-centered. And again, this one guy that I mentioned at work, when I worked at Ford, Gary, I mean, I said, you're an only child. And how do you know that? Because he was self-centered. I could tell just by the way he was raised that he was not raised with the idea or the perspective of other people around him. And so helping them grow into that functioning family, they will know that there's other people. They'll know that we're working together. They'll know that, we're part of a bigger whole here, and that is part of that family. And then if we begin to practice child-centered parenting, and again, that's where, the child becomes the center of the family rather than part of the family circle. And understanding that a family is a circle, and child-centered parenting would be to take the child and put them in the center of that circle, where the parent's schedule all revolves around the children. They go where the children want to go. They watch what the children want to watch, and they'll say to the child, "Well, is it okay if we do this? You're the boss. Is it okay if we go here? Is it okay will you eat this, or will you eat that? Or what do you want for dinner? Because we don't want to make something that you don't like." Where everything is, again, about the child. Oh, we can't go there because Johnny's schedule. We can't go there. We can't do this because it's all about the child, right? And it's very easy, and again, in the family, to become, especially when the children are younger and more dependent. I mean, obviously, there are going to be times where, a child, especially an infant, who's in complete dependence on their parents for anything. They can't walk anywhere. They can't tell you anything. You're pretty much focused on them. But we're talking about when they're growing up, when they're getting a little older, and they start having needs, and they start having opinions and wants and desires and everything, and it all, again, comes right down to them. And again, if we don't stimulate communication and show them love, acceptance in the family, they're going to find that acceptance somewhere else. And this is why it's so important to make sure that your child knows that they belong, because if they don't, they're going to go to where they feel belonged. They're just going to say, well, you know what, I'm out of here. I feel belonged. Or, again, even if a father isn't properly, I believe the importance of a father and his daughters and their relationship, to make sure that, that father-daughter relationship is important. Because if you don't have that, and you're not making sure your daughter knows that she's loved by you, and she's your little princess and all these things, she's going to go find some guy who, will tell her those things and give her that security that she's looking for, that maybe she's not getting from her dad. And your responsibility, your role and responsibility as a father is important, especially when it comes to your daughters. Your boys, again, for fathers, making sure that you're that leader, that role model, and all of those different things. Because if we don't give that to them, if our child is either the center of attention, we vacillate over to this child-centered parenting, the child is going to grow up rejecting everything. If we don't love them the way that we're supposed to, and bring them into that place, of course, again, where they know where they belong, they know why they belong, what they're supposed to be doing, then we're going to have a balanced child. They're going to grow up loved. They're going to grow up knowing that they're appreciated in the family. They're not going to go somewhere else to look for acceptance. And our children should always feel accepted. They should always feel accepted. And that includes in times of misbehavior. We'll, of course, deal with that later, but how to deal with, sin and misbehavior and all of that. But, when a child does wrong, you don't stop loving them. They don't stop being part of your family. You do have to lovingly correct them. But, again, even a child will understand that discipline and correction is love, right? You're doing it for love. You're doing it because you don't want them following a particular path and carrying out particular sins. So they will accept that. Now, it talks about our parenting past. See, we are here today. We're all part of our past. We're all products of our past. And I talked a little bit about my upbringing, and we all have an upbringing, and we all have different generations. We've got different generations that go back. Some of us, I could say, well, back in the 40s, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and some people here might have memories of the 40s. I was alive in the 40s. I remember that. Some of us may remember the 70s. Some of us would like to forget the 70s. Some of us remember the 80s. Some of us don't remember the 80s. But, we have a varying degree of age and generation here. And no matter what generation you came from, we are products of our past. So how we parent and how we perceive family and life is all part of how we grew up in our particular generation. And there have been, and it's very, very clear when you look at it all, the different generations going back 100 years. And again, realizing that there's, if you will, a chain reaction. The Bible talks about particular family traits and family behaviors going to the third and to the fourth generations, right? Abraham lied about, well, it was a half lie, you might say, when he went to Pharaoh. Abraham said, "Oh, she's my sister," which she was his half sister, but that wasn't the whole truth. It was a lie, and nearly got him in trouble. And guess what his son did? The exact same thing, right? We pick up certain traits from our parents, not only genetically, but also practically, because we've seen the examples and different things like that. So it's a chain reaction from the events of our past, bringing them into parenting and present day. So back in the 1930s, and again, I wasn't born until 1964, but I did grow up with baby boomer parents. My parents would have been considered, well, not quite baby boomers, but they were kind of in between. But during the 30s, of course, the stock market crash in 1929 brought on the Great Depression. And if you think you have economic problems today, man, I tell you one thing, during the Great Depression, you did with whatever you had, and I mean, just getting money to feed your family was a chore. Getting a job was a chore. I think, if I remember right, the unemployment rate was about 25%. And when you did work, I mean, you could barely afford anything. And you know, when you live in that sort of depression and that sort of economic problems, I mean, I watched some of these old, like the Little Rascals and stuff like that, and a lot of the Little Rascals, that was taken during the Great Depression. And back in the old days, like these shoes that I got on, they've got leather soles on them. Back in the day, they didn't have plastic soles and all. Everything was made of leather. So you wore leather shoes, whether you were a kid, whether you were a teenager, whether you were an adult. You didn't have Nikes and Reeboks and all of those things. You know, we'll talk about the generation gap in a little bit. But everything was made out of leather. So your shoes would wear out. The leather on the bottom of your shoes. And you couldn't go to a shoe repair guy because you didn't have money. And it's a reality. People used to stuff cardboard into their shoes so that their foot wasn't hitting the ground, because you couldn't afford another pair of shoes. You couldn't afford to take it down to the I believe they call them tinkers to get your is that the right word? I think maybe some of you know. Is it a tinker? They used to call the old shoe repair people. Cobbler, that's it. Yeah, cobbler. He would take it down to the cobbler, and he would fix your shoes. But these didn't have money for that. And if your shoelace broke, you would tie it. You wouldn't throw it in the garbage. And in your shirts. And how about Mama patching your pants, right? Putting patches on. How many? I was going to say, how many people have ever seen somebody walking around with a patch on a hole in their jeans? Everybody just loves holes in their jeans now. My mom, if I ever got a hole in my jeans, my mom would patch them up, or she would sew them up, or do something. She says, Michael, you're no going out looking like that. So anyways, you know, because she grew up in that, right? My mom was born in the 30s, and she caught the tail end of the Great Depression. This is the way it was. But those children, could you imagine being a child growing up in that era, wondering when you came home if you were going to have supper? You know, you see sometimes in the Little Rascals, you know, them taking one pea, and dividing it into several parts so that everyone in the family could have a little bit of food to eat. You know, we kind of look at that and say, well, that's kind of funny, but that was the reality. So these kids grew up and in that era of absolute depression. And so during the war, of course, the war started, and after the war, prosperity, the economic boom. And so these children that grew up in this poverty were now suddenly able to get jobs and able to buy a house and able to get a car, you know. And by the way, in the 40s and 50s, that was it. You know, the American family was a suburban home with one car in the driveway, mama taking care of the kids, and dad out working, coming home at 5 o'clock, and you know, that was just the American family, and that was the American dream, and that was the way it was all supposed to be. And because of the war, a lot of women went to work, and a lot of them continued to work. And that changed, of course, when before that period of time, a woman would stop working as soon as she was married. But after that, she would continue to work after she was married. But once usually kids came along, she would come out of the workforce. And of course, that's changed. But, you know, that's the way it was. They were getting all kinds of money, and money that they never had before. So they wanted to make sure that their children, the baby boomer kids, that they had a good start. You know, that the mom and dad worked their hands to the bone, saved everything. You know, they wanted to get everything and keep everything and save everything. And the baby boomer generations, they're the type that had pantries full of, you know, stocked with enough food to last until the cows came home. You know, and they would have freezers in the basement with 4 sides of beef in them, just in case things go bad again. They'd have lots of money. They were using all that money to make sure little Johnny and little Sally had an education, and so it became very child-centered, where, you know, little Johnny was to make sure that they weren't going to have the hardships. They had good clothes, you know, they had good upbringings, and then good education. Education really started in the 40s and the 50s. And what happened to those kids? that grew up under the baby boomers. They turned into the 70s and the 60s pot-smoking hippies. They rejected everything. They rejected everything their parents stood for. They rejected their parents. They rejected authority. They rejected society and as a whole when we think about that. And these individuals that grew up during the 60s, it was an unprecedented social and political upheaval. And again, if you had the privilege of growing up in the 60s and the 70s, you remember the protests, you remember the anti-government protests, anti-war protests. And for the first time ever, there was a generation gap. This is where kids started dressing different than mom and dad. Kids started acting different than mom and dad. They had different values than mom and dad. There was just a gap between the generations. And things changed for the first time really in the history of our world. We saw this generation gap. So not only in every way outwardly, but inwardly as well, they rejected everything. In the 60s and 70s, people, they might be called the generation that rejected everything. And so they have kids, get married, and after they got over their hippie, little kick and all of that, they got married and they had kids. And how did their kids grow up? Well, those parents, they practice a mixed bag of philosophies, and those again, I'm in that group, right? I grew up. I was early 60s, 64, so I grew up, in that period. I was born, again, pretty much to baby boomers. So my generation, as young parents, we didn't know which way to go. We were kind of stuck in a vacuum because we had still some of the old school people, and we had some of the new school people, and how were we supposed to parent? How were we supposed to raise our children and bring up our children? And we had during the 60s and 70s, of course, the rise of feminism, and that began to change society. And so that generation and the generation really even to follow, they became very possession and finance oriented. It became all about money and money and having bigger cars, having bigger houses. I think I did a message a few years ago. The statistics are a little foggy, but I don't quote me exactly. But I believe in about 1965, the average size of a home in North America was about 1,100 square feet. What would be the average home today? What would be the average square footage of a home being built today? 4,000? 3,000? 2,500? 2,300? Yeah. And there are homes obviously all over the place, 4, 5, 6, 7,000 square feet. You see some of them being built, massive homes. The homes that we grew up, when I was a kid, growing up, the biggest house we had was in Lambeth, and it was 1,200 square feet. And everything began to get bigger, and everybody wanted bigger, and everybody wanted more. And of course, that brought in the 80s and the 90s generation. And, the 80s and the 90s, that's where, remember the yuppies. Who remembers what a yuppie was? Young uptown person in suits, right? Everybody wanted to be a yuppie. And it became, again, very fashionable to be rich. It became very driven by finances and social success. And really, the 80s and 90s were when child-centered parenting became the norm. It really became the norm. When I was, again, my generation, we did have a lot of child-centered parenting. I just think about myself, and I think about other parents that I knew, friends and all of that, and especially before we were saved and in the world, and how they were raising their kids. And I did know one thing that what I saw happening in my society wasn't what I wanted and what I believed was right when it came to raising children. And yeah, sometimes you wonder how you lost your hair. You kind of maybe sometimes pull it all out because you get frustrated with seeing how society is going, and the drop of discipline, the drop of parental authority, where, it wasn't, I even remember somebody saying in the schools now, when I was a kid, I called my teacher, if it was a man, I called him sir, and if it was a woman, I called her ma'am, or Mr., Mr. one math teacher, Kucherawi, Mr. Nixon, whatever, or Mrs. Parrott, or Miss Parrott, or Mrs. whatever. That's how we address them. But, oh, no, now you can't do that anymore because, we're not supposed to be their authority. We're supposed to be their buddies. And so now you call your teacher Bob, and you call your teacher Sally. You call your you don't have Misters or Misses. You don't have sirs or ma'ams or anything like this, and because that's not the way it is. And it became the same in the parenting thing too. The parent, you're not supposed to be your child's authority. You're just supposed to be, their buddies and all of this, and just understand that they're equally part of your family, and that you're just, you're to listen to them and you're to take their orders and do all this. And so child-centered parenting became the norm. And of course, the world trying to push out discipline, correction. I remember seeing an article in the London Free Press. It said no, not the World Health Organization, NATO, I believe it was NATO, just said that they believe that they said that if a child threw a temper tantrum, ran into the room and closed the door, a parent doesn't have the right to go in there and confront them. And they said that they believe that even pointing your finger at a child was assault. You're not supposed to point your finger at a child. I remember Harry Lipset, he was a high school teacher in Ingersoll for many years, and we were talking one day, and he says, I had to retire earlier. I couldn't take it anymore. He says, I got in trouble with the school board because I went like this to a child. So I got put before the board. When a child was acting up or something, he said, I can't take it anymore. I'm not going to be a prisoner. I know that we had teachers in Wasaga Beach here. I'm getting really off on these things. I don't know if you remember this. There was a whole bunch of teachers that walked off because they were being assaulted by the kids. They were literally being assaulted by the kids. And they said, we can't do anything about it. We're not allowed to do anything. We're not allowed to say anything. We're not allowed to correct a child. We're not allowed to point our finger at them. And they said, what are we supposed to do? And so, yeah, they walked off the job. So in parenting, this is kind of bled in. And so these 80s and 90s people, again, had this child-centered philosophy where mom and dad, they felt guilty in many ways because they began this thing that became known as latchkey kids. How many people know what a latchkey kid is? We lived in Tillsonburg. Every day there was a girl that would come over. She'd come over to our house. And she would play with Justine and different things like that. And we'd say, well, where's your mom and dad? And they said, oh, they're at work. I think she was 11, 10, 9 years old. Somewhere around there. And where's your mom and dad? Oh, they're at work. I said, well, why don't you go home? I said, I can't get in. Bus would drop her off. She had nowhere to go. She had no key to get into the house. I said, do you have any brothers, sisters? Like, what's going on? She just was totally abandoned for several hours until mom and dad got home. And, that's what we call latchkey kid. They're just there. So mom and dad, mom starts working. Dad's out at work. And, of course, he's working overtime because they got to make sure that they've got the best of everything for their kids because they feel guilty because they've abandoned their kids because they're not there for them. And so they begin to, again, that's where we get this child-centered parenting, where it's like, okay, well, we got to spend time with the kids because we've abandoned them all day, and we're not there for them. So when we do have time with them, we're going to give them everything they want. And it's horrible the way the family's fallen apart. Dr. Laura Schlesinger, I don't think she's around too much anymore, but she used to have a radio talk show. She was a converted Jew, and she was a psychologist, and she was very, very, very good. And she ended up getting a television show, and then she eventually started speaking out against homosexuality, and then so they actually shut her down because homosexuals were protesting her and different things like that. But she had very good moral standards. But she believed, and I saw her on Dr. Phil one time, and she said moms should stay home with their kids, raise their kids. And these women in the audience started on her and started saying all kinds of things. And she just said this. She said, listen, she says, if when you were a kid, you would have wanted your mom to go to work and leave you at a babysitter, if that's what you wanted for you, would you stand up? And not one person stood up, not one person. So I would have wanted my mom to send me to a babysitter and go to work. And no, kids don't want that. And of course, today, I mean, if you were to say that, some people would probably say that you're just nuts. I mean, what do you mean someone should stay home? Mom should stay home with the parent, and or mom should stay home and parent and be there for the kids. In society today, that's the craziest thing that they've ever heard because they've never seen it. It's just so obscure. I grew up with it, so to me, it's just the way it used to be. But to a young person today, they've never heard of that sort of crazy idea. So that's where we are today. So this materialistic society we're in today, and where we are today. You see, today now we have these young people that grew up in that era where those 80s and 90s, parents raised their children, latchkey kids and all of that. Now these kids are now out there in society. They're growing up, and how are the young people today? How are the young people today? Are they stable and balanced members of society? And somewhere along the line, we've got to realize that we've messed up. We've dropped the ball. We're talking about hard work. The 30s, those children that were raised during that depression, they knew how to roll up their sleeves and do some hard work. And our country was built on hard work ethic. But now all of these latchkey kids and all of these people that were raised, everything given to them, and it was all about them and all child-centered. Now, this isn't just a few exceptions. There are adults out there. The one lady, now maybe I shouldn't call her lady. The one woman, she's about, I think, 21. And she kind of went viral. She was suing her parents for $1,500 a month because she said it was her parents' responsibility to pay for her life expenses because she didn't ask to be born. So she sued her parents and said her parents should be paying her rent. And the sad thing about it is she won. But then they went to a higher court, and the higher court struck it down. But then she was appealing. And you see people all the time today, that very same mentality. I didn't ask to be born. My parents should be. I shouldn't be going to work and working for a living. That's just horrible. It's just, what do you, me work? What are you talking about? You're saying, Pastor, you're just talking about we're talking about a lot of people. This whole woke mentality is all, hard work is bad. And so this is the generation that are really kind of coming into adulthood right now. And you think to yourself, what kind of parents are they going to be? What kind of parents are they going to be? Well, when you have your kids, I hope they do the same thing to you and sue you because they didn't ask to be born either. How did we drop the ball? Where did we drop the ball? So we today, I kind of will, I'll say this, when I was raising, when Diane and I were raising our kids, we were probably in about maybe 20 or 15%, of parents at that time were raising their kids, of course, maybe not all with Christian values and all of that, but at least with the discipline and with the family structure and all of that, there were still a good chunk of the population doing that. But today, to raise your children in today's society with biblical principles and in a biblical way, it is just going to be totally foreign to most people. And so we need today, I believe, wisdom more than any time in the history of our world and our society. And as the family goes, of course, so goes the nation, right? Families, I said 30 years ago families were in a mess, and today it's worse. Families are just out the door. They're just out the door. We had a couple that came here for a little bit a few years ago, and she was telling me they lived in Collingwood at the time, and she was saying there was a couple kids that used to come over, and they would sit down for their family meal, and they got talking to these two kids, and I don't know how it came up, but they said, well, we've never sat down together as a family and had a meal. See, Mom was never home. Dad was never home. The kids were latchkey completely. And if they wanted food, they would just go to the freezer and grab the microwavable chicken thing or whatever was in there in their packages, and they would throw it in the microwave and eat. That's all they did. That's all they ever did. They never sat down as a family. And most people will tell you, and I believe it's very true, family time at the table is so important. It's a time to talk. It's a time to socialize with your family. It's a time you come together, and most, I believe, good family counselors will tell you that time at the meal, that at the table is so important. So again, we need today to be wise parents. We need it more than at any time, I believe, in our history. And I think in here, in your book, he's got some quotes about the dangers of daycare and different things like that, and the results of many of the kids, the results, I think is obvious. These kids that grew up in daycare. And, I know, going back to Dr. Laura, this one lady actually called up. She was pretty upset about what Dr. Laura said about mothers staying home with their kids. And she did go back to work, Dr. Laura, after her kids were in school. But she said, I'm home by the time they get home. They don't come home to an empty house. And she did practice what she preached. She was home when the kids were home. And but this person called up, and they were all upset. And they said, I'm a daycare worker, and I don't like what you say about I love these kids. I love all the kids. And Dr. Lord just said, well, do you believe that you love those kids as much as a mother would love her kids? No, I don't. And she got pretty quiet. And not only nobody's going to love a child more than a mom. And not only that, when you think about that idea, it is undermining the family, no matter how you cut it. Now, it's fine. You're going out, send your kids to a babysitter, or have a babysitter come over. We're not talking about that, or the occasional, your mom and dad take a trip for a couple days. They send their kids to some. But we're not talking about, things like that. We're talking about full-time, a child abandonment, really, leaving them with other people on a regular basis like that. And so, again, that has led us to the place where people today have really, like I said, no concept of what a functional family is. It's foreign to them. What are you talking about? This idea of raising your children and being home with them and mom and dad and discipline and a unit, a structure where the children, of course, they're part of the family and they fit in and all of this. It is absolutely and completely foreign to our world, except maybe in Christian circles. And wise parents, we need to be wise, and let's make sure that we're not allowing the things of the world to interfere with what God has given us to do. And we must adjust to changing times and still hold to unchanging principles. Don't agree with much Jimmy Carter ever said, but that's a good thought. Times change, but let's not let go of unchanging principles, the ones that God has given us for being parents. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for this time together. Bless the morning service for your glory. We'll praise you and thank you in Jesus' name, and amen.